By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical point. Japan, once expanding across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, was now in retreat. Allied forces, primarily the United States, had secured key islands, cutting supply lines and weakening Japan's ability to reinforce distant territories. Battles in the Mariana Islands, the Philippines, and elsewhere demonstrated the growing dominance of Allied air power and naval strength. Japanese leaders faced the stark reality. Conventional warfare was no longer enough to stop the advancing Allied fleets. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered heavy losses in previous battles, including the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Skilled pilots were scarce, and experienced crews had been destroyed. At the same time, the United States' industrial capacity meant they could replace losses quickly. Japan, by contrast, could not. The military leadership began searching for methods that could slow the Allied advance, inflict maximum damage, and inspire a sense of fear in the enemy. It was in this context that the idea of special attack units, later known as kamikaze, gained traction. The term kamikaze means divine wind, recalling the typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasions centuries earlier. For Japan's military leaders, these missions were framed not as reckless suicides, but as acts of supreme loyalty and honor. Young pilots would willingly crash their aircraft into enemy ships, sacrificing themselves to protect their homeland. Kamikaze tactics first appeared in late 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese Navy, heavily outnumbered and lacking sufficient air cover, sought a way to maximize damage. Small groups of specially trained pilots were instructed to dive their planes directly into Allied carriers and battleships. These missions were seen as a desperate measure, but one that could create significant disruption. Even a single kamikaze strike could sink a ship or disable it for weeks. The selection of pilots followed strict criteria. Most were young men, often between 17 and 25, who showed courage, discipline, and an understanding of duty. Some volunteered, others were chosen by superiors. Training was intense but brief, focusing on basic flight skills, navigation, and the specific techniques for crashing a plane into a target. The pilots were shown the mechanics of their mission, how to approach a ship, at what angle to strike, and how to ensure maximum damage. There was no escape plan, and survival was not expected. Cultural and ideological factors reinforced this approach. Japanese society at the time placed a strong emphasis on loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. The Bushido Code, traditionally associated with samurai, had been adapted by military leaders to instill a sense of duty in the young pilots. Death in service of the emperor was framed as the highest honor. Propaganda reinforced this message, portraying kamikaze missions as heroic and noble. Pilots were told that their sacrifice would protect families, communities, and the nation itself. By early 1945, the use of kamikaze attacks increased. Japan's home islands were under threat, and battles such as those in the Philippines demanded every available resource. Squadrons of kamikaze pilots were organized into takotai units, each with a specific mission and target. They were provided with light aircraft, often outdated or stripped-down fighters, loaded with explosives. Their targets were primarily Allied carriers and battleships, whose firepower and mobility posed the greatest threat to Japan's defense. The strategic goal of kamikaze operations was clear: inflict maximum damage, slow the enemy advance, and weaken morale. While individual missions might destroy a single ship, the cumulative effect of repeated attacks could create chaos among naval operations. Allied commanders quickly recognized the threat, and defensive measures were intensified. Anti-aircraft guns, radar tracking, and combat air patrols became critical to protecting ships from these suicide strikes. Behind every mission were personal stories, often recorded in letters. Pilots wrote to family members, expressing love, sorrow, and a sense of duty. Some thanked parents for their upbringing, others spoke to siblings, and some left notes for their future children. These letters reveal the human cost behind the strategic decisions. They show young men who understood the likelihood of death, yet felt compelled to act for a cause larger than themselves. The emergence of kamikaze tactics also reflected Japan's shrinking options. Conventional naval battles, aerial dogfights, and artillery exchanges were no longer sufficient to challenge the Allied advance. Kamikaze attacks allowed Japan to impose a psychological cost, forcing the enemy to treat every incoming aircraft as a potential threat. The unpredictability and intensity of these attacks would later be studied by military historians as a significant, if tragic, adaptation in modern warfare. By the spring of 1945, preparations were complete for large-scale kamikaze operations. Pilots, ground crews, and commanders understood the stakes. Each mission was carefully timed and coordinated. Targets were assigned, aircraft fueled and armed, and final briefings delivered. The stage was set for the missions that would define the last desperate months of Japan's war effort in the Pacific. The context of these operations reveals the intersection of strategy, ideology, and human sacrifice. Japan was not only fighting against the overwhelming force of Allied armies and navies, but also confronting the limits of its own capacity to resist. Kamikaze pilots were both a product of circumstance and of culture, a tragic embodiment of Japan's determination to resist at any cost. The stage was now set for the first missions that would bring these young men into direct confrontation with Allied forces, carrying letters, love, and the weight of a nation on their shoulders. The story of kamikaze pilots can be understood through multiple perspectives, each revealing a different layer of human and strategic reality. One of the most profound is the human cost. These pilots were young men, often barely adults, sent on missions with no expectation of survival. Before takeoff, many wrote letters to their families. In carefully folded pages, they expressed love, sorrow, and duty. One pilot wrote to his mother, thanking her for raising him and apologizing for leaving her behind. Another addressed his younger sister, encouraging her to live a full life even as he faced death. These letters, preserved in archives, reveal fear, resolve, and the tragic awareness of the inevitable. Families would receive these notes posthumously, their words forever frozen in time. The tactical perspective provides insight into why kamikaze missions were considered necessary. Japan's conventional forces were weakened, and Allied ships dominated the Pacific. A single plane crashing into a carrier could disable it for weeks, or even sink it. Pilots were trained to approach targets at steep angles, maximizing explosive impact. Squadrons coordinated attacks to overwhelm defenses, often striking simultaneously to increase the chance of success. Despite being desperate measures, these attacks reflected careful planning. Commanders understood that every pilot lost was a human life, yet they calculated that the potential damage to the enemy justified the missions. From the standpoint of technology and aircraft, kamikaze missions highlighted both innovation and limitation. Many planes were stripped-down fighters, light but fast, carrying explosives in place of ammunition. Some older aircraft, obsolete in conventional dogfights, were pressed into service. Pilots had to master difficult takeoff, navigation, and diving techniques, often under extreme stress. The simplicity of the aircraft belied the complexity of the mission. A direct collision with a moving target at high speed required precision, courage, and steady nerves. The effectiveness of kamikaze attacks relied not on technological superiority, but on the combination of human will and calculated risk. Leadership decisions also shaped the kamikaze phenomenon. Japanese commanders, facing a shrinking strategic window, embraced these missions as a means to delay inevitable defeat. High-ranking officers trained pilots, planned routes, and timed attacks to maximize damage. They selected specific targets based on strategic importance, including aircraft carriers, battleships, and supply vessels. At the same time, military propaganda reinforced the narrative of honor and sacrifice. Leaders balanced the practical goals of warfare with cultural expectations, turning individual acts of death into instruments of strategy. The enemy perspective reveals how Allied forces reacted to these missions. Sailors on ships in the Pacific faced an unpredictable threat. Radar and combat air patrols became essential, and anti-aircraft gunners remained on constant alert. The psychological impact was severe. Knowing that every incoming plane might be a kamikaze attack created tension, fatigue, and fear. Even if a plane was shot down, the knowledge that some attacks would succeed weighed heavily on the crew. Reports from survivors describe a mix of awe at the pilot's determination and horror at the destruction caused. From this angle, kamikaze missions were not just physical attacks, but psychological weapons. Finally, the moral and strategic consequences offer another perspective. Japan achieved some short-term success, sinking and damaging several Allied ships. Yet the human cost was staggering. Thousands of pilots lost, families devastated, and a society increasingly exposed to war's brutality. Strategically, kamikaze operations could not stop the Allied advance. They slowed progress, but ultimately could not change the outcome of the war. Morally, the missions remain controversial, as they involved deliberate sacrifice of young lives. Historians view them as a combination of cultural belief, military necessity, and desperate innovation. They illustrate the tension between duty and humanity, honor and survival. By examining these perspectives together, the kamikaze story becomes more than a tale of suicide attacks. It is a study of courage, discipline, cultural expectation, and the limits of human endurance. Each angle, human cost, tactics, technology, leadership, enemy reaction, and moral consequence, adds depth to the narrative. The letters of pilots, the calculations of commanders, the defenses of Allied crews, and the broader strategic impact all converge, providing a complete picture of this tragic chapter in history. The perspectives also highlight the personal and collective dimension of kamikaze operations. On one level, each pilot faced an individual choice: to follow orders, to embrace a mission that promised death. On another, the entire nation participated in a system that valorized sacrifice and reinforced obedience. Letters, diaries, and official records document the weight of this duality. Individual human emotion pressed against national duty. Even as young men took off for their final flights, they carried the hopes, fears, and expectations of Japan itself. Understanding these perspectives prepares us to witness the climax of kamikaze operations, where strategy, courage, and tragedy intersected in battle. The pilots' letters, tactical planning, and human cost all led to decisive attacks that would define the final months of the Pacific War. The true turning point of the kamikaze program came in the spring of 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. On April 1st, Allied forces landed on Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific to that date. The island was crucial. It provided a base for air operations against Japan's home islands and offered a staging ground for the planned invasion of Kyushu. Japanese commanders understood the stakes and prepared a last-ditch defense. Among their strategies was the deployment of kamikaze units in unprecedented numbers. By early April, hundreds of young pilots were stationed at airfields across southern Kyushu and nearby islands. These pilots were assigned to multiple Takotai squadrons, each with specific targets: aircraft carriers, battleships, and transport vessels. The mission was clear: strike, inflict maximum damage, and accept certain death. On April 6th, the first waves of kamikaze pilots took off at dawn, their small planes barely visible against the bright sky. Ground crews watched silently, knowing many of these men would never return. The first attacks were devastating. At 7:25, the USS Shangri-La, an Essex-class aircraft carrier, faced multiple kamikaze planes diving at its decks. Anti-aircraft fire shredded some planes, but others broke through. One plane struck the flight deck near the forward elevator, causing fires that burned for hours. Simultaneously, the USS Enterprise and other carriers faced coordinated strikes, with pilots targeting critical points: fuel storage, ammunition magazines, and aircraft on deck. Ships rocked violently as explosions ripped through decks, and sailors fought desperately to contain fires. The effectiveness of these attacks was both tactical and psychological. Ships that survived suffered damage that reduced their operational capabilities for days or weeks. Sailors were forced to remain on high alert at all hours, knowing that every incoming aircraft could be a kamikaze. Radar and fighter patrols intercepted many attackers, but the sheer number of planes, combined with unpredictable angles of attack, made complete defense impossible. Casualties were heavy. Hundreds of sailors were killed or wounded, and multiple ships required extensive repairs. By mid-April, kamikaze operations intensified. The Japanese Navy and Air Force coordinated mass waves of attacks, sometimes involving dozens of planes at a time. Pilots flew in carefully timed formations, often taking off from multiple airfields to strike simultaneously. The missions were dangerous, even before reaching the target. Many planes were old or lightly maintained, prone to mechanical failure. Navigation over open water was difficult, and pilots had to maintain precise courses while carrying explosive payloads. Any mistake could end the mission before reaching the enemy. One of the most infamous attacks occurred on April 7, 1945, when a single pilot struck the USS Bunker Hill, causing catastrophic explosions in the forward ammunition storage. Fires burned for hours, and over 300 sailors were killed, with nearly 400 more wounded. Eyewitness accounts described the shock of explosions, smoke filling the air, and sailors fighting to save both the ship and their comrades. Letters from pilots who participated in these missions sometimes reveal a mixture of fear and determination, as they understood both the magnitude of the damage they could cause and the certainty of their own deaths. As the battle progressed, Allied forces adapted. Combat air patrols intercepted many incoming planes, and improved radar allowed ships to anticipate attack patterns. Anti-aircraft guns were placed strategically, and coordination between vessels improved. Despite these measures, kamikaze strikes remained a constant threat. The attacks forced changes in naval strategy, slowing the Allied advance and creating delays in the Okinawa campaign. Japanese commanders achieved their tactical goal: inflict maximum damage, disrupt operations, and impose psychological strain on enemy forces. The climax of kamikaze operations was not limited to a single day. Throughout April and May, waves of pilots launched repeated attacks. Squadrons often flew multiple sorties, striking wherever Allied ships concentrated. The combination of small planes carrying heavy explosives and the courage, or desperation, of the pilots created a lethal situation. Hundreds of sailors perished, dozens of ships were damaged, and the Allied fleet faced constant vigilance. Each attack added to the cumulative toll, demonstrating both the tactical ingenuity and the human cost of Japan's strategy. The turning point of the kamikaze program also became clear in its impact on both sides. For Japan, the missions symbolized courage and sacrifice but underscored desperation. Pilots were lost at a staggering rate, and trained aircrew could not be replaced. For the Allies, the attacks demonstrated the limits of conventional defense against an opponent willing to trade life for impact. By the end of May 1945, the cumulative effect of kamikaze strikes had left a permanent mark on naval operations and military planning. The ships that survived were scarred, both physically and psychologically, and the lessons learned would shape naval strategy in the post-war era. The climax of kamikaze operations in Okinawa represents a convergence of strategy, technology, and human will. Each attack involved careful planning, precise execution, and extraordinary courage. At the same time, it revealed the desperation of a nation facing imminent defeat. The letters written by pilots, the strategic calculations of commanders, and the heroic efforts of Allied sailors together paint a vivid picture of the intense, tragic climax of Japan's final air operations. The aftermath of the kamikaze attacks during the Battle of Okinawa was staggering. Hundreds of young pilots had flown their final missions, many writing letters to family members that would never be delivered in person. Their deaths left families mourning, communities grieving, and a nation confronting the cost of desperation. For the Allies, the impact was equally profound, though in a different way. Ships were damaged or sunk, hundreds of sailors killed or wounded, and every surviving crew member carried memories of the attacks into the rest of the campaign. Casualty numbers were immense. During the Okinawa campaign, more than 3,800 Allied sailors were killed and over 4,900 wounded due to kamikaze strikes. Japanese losses were even heavier. Thousands of pilots died in missions, along with support crews and personnel involved in maintaining aircraft and planning operations. These numbers represent only the immediate deaths. The psychological toll, stress, fear, and exhaustion among sailors extended far beyond the battlefield. Many who survived reported nightmares, anxiety, and deep awareness of how fragile life was at sea under constant kamikaze threat. The physical destruction was dramatic. Ships struck by kamikaze planes often suffered severe damage, flight decks torn apart, engines disabled, fuel storage ignited, and ammunition exploded. Some vessels sank entirely, while others were out of action for weeks. Aircraft carriers, critical to Allied naval power, were prime targets, and even minor damage could delay operations, disrupt air sorties, and reduce the fleet's effectiveness. Ports, airfields, and nearby installations were also threatened as attacks spread across multiple islands. Each strike was a reminder of the unpredictable nature of these suicide missions. The psychological and societal impact on Japan was profound. The loss of so many young pilots, many barely adults, was felt in communities nationwide. Parents, siblings, and extended families received letters that documented both love and duty, but no longer contained hope for a return. The cultural ideal of honor and death, emphasized through Bushido and military propaganda, offered some solace, yet grief and trauma were unavoidable. Communities were left to reconcile the idea of sacrifice with the tangible loss of life. Strategically, the kamikaze attacks had mixed results. They inflicted real damage on Allied fleets and slowed certain operations. Ships were forced to move cautiously, naval planners had to anticipate suicide strikes, and resources had to be diverted to defensive measures. However, these operations could not stop the Allied advance. The overwhelming industrial capacity, technological superiority, and logistical support of the United States ensured that losses, while tragic, were ultimately replaceable. For Japan, the strategy delayed the inevitable but could not reverse the course of the war. Historical assessments have emphasized both the effectiveness and the tragedy of kamikaze tactics. Military historians note that while these missions occasionally sank major ships, they exacted the heaviest cost on Japan itself. The loss of trained pilots, aircraft, and morale cannot be underestimated. Allied reports from the time highlight the surprise and horror of the attacks. Sailors described planes diving with precise intent, explosions ripping through decks, and the chaos of fighting fires and attending to wounded comrades simultaneously. These accounts illustrate how kamikaze tactics blended operational damage with psychological pressure. Official reports from Allied commanders reinforced the significance of kamikaze attacks. After-action reviews documented damage to specific vessels, estimated numbers of planes and pilots involved, and lessons for future engagements. Ships like the USS Bunker Hill, USS Shangri-La, and USS Enterprise required months of repair. Anti-aircraft tactics, radar coverage, and combat air patrol procedures were revised to anticipate suicide attacks. The Allied military learned that even small, lightly armed planes could achieve devastating results when pilots were willing to sacrifice themselves. The letters of kamikaze pilots remain among the most poignant historical evidence of the human cost. Many expressed love, hope, and apology in a single page. Some conveyed pride and duty, emphasizing loyalty to family and emperor. Others revealed fear and doubt, yet continued with their mission. These documents bridge the strategic and personal dimensions of war, reminding us that behind every military decision were individual lives, hopes, and final moments of reflection. The aftermath also highlighted the limitations of Japan's strategy. Kamikaze operations were emotionally powerful and tactically disruptive, but they did not alter the larger strategic balance. By mid-1945, the Allied advance was unstoppable. Okinawa fell, the Japanese Navy was crippled, and air superiority allowed bombing campaigns to devastate the home islands. Kamikaze pilots had fulfilled their duty as defined by their commanders and culture, yet the war moved relentlessly toward Japan's surrender in August 1945. In the broader scope of history, the aftermath of kamikaze attacks teaches multiple lessons. It reveals the intersection of culture, military necessity, and human sacrifice. It shows how strategy can exploit ideology and devotion, yet also how such strategies can lead to immense national loss. For the Allies, it highlighted the unpredictability and adaptability of the enemy. For historians and future generations, it provides both evidence and reflection, how desperate measures can define a campaign, yet come at extraordinary human cost. The culmination of these events, the ships damaged, the lives lost, the letters written, the strategies tested, sets the stage for reflection on the broader meaning of kamikaze missions. From this aftermath, we see not only the tactical outcomes, but also the enduring human story, which echoes far beyond the battlefield and resonates through history. The story of the kamikaze pilots is a story of courage, duty, and tragedy. Young men, many barely out of their teens, faced the certainty of death with a sense of purpose shaped by culture, training, and ideology. Their letters, carefully written before takeoff, reveal the humanity behind the missions: love for family, sorrow for leaving home, pride in service, and the quiet acceptance of fate. These documents allow us to see not only the strategy of war, but the personal sacrifices that were demanded. Kamikaze operations also demonstrate the limits of conventional military thinking. When a nation faces overwhelming odds, it may turn to extreme measures. The pilots' sacrifices were both a tactical tool and a cultural statement, intended to delay the enemy and inspire fear, but they could not change the outcome of the war. Their actions remind us that warfare is not only about machines, strategy, or territory, but about human lives, choices, and the weight of duty. The psychological impact on both sides of the conflict is lasting. Allied sailors faced the unpredictability and terror of suicide attacks, while Japanese society mourned a generation of lost youth. Ships were damaged, fleets slowed, and families left behind carried grief that could never fully heal. Yet the kamikaze pilot stories also evoke reflection on resilience, courage, and the complexity of human motivation under extreme circumstances. History remembers these pilots not as instruments of destruction alone, but as individuals shaped by circumstance, ideology, and personal conviction. Their missions highlight the collision of strategy, culture, and morality. In the end, the kamikaze pilots remind us of the cost of war, the fragility of life, and the enduring power of human resolve, even in the face of certain death. Through their letters, actions, and the lasting impact of their missions, the story of kamikaze pilots continues to teach us about sacrifice, honor, and the human consequences of decisions made in the heat of history. Their final flights leave a somber echo, one that history records with both precision and compassion. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the courage, sacrifice, and humanity behind history. Subscribe to our channel for more deep, cinematic documentaries on World War II, where real events, real people, and real stories come alive. Like and share this video to honor the memory of those who lived and died in one of history's most extraordinary chapters. Comment below which letter or story of these pilots struck you the most. We'd love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation about history alive. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next documentary, where history is not just remembered, it's experienced.